going to draw that out a little bit more explicitly now. And I think the barriers around inclusion have been well discussed, they're well understood, they're well documented within the literature as well. But Shuelka, who is the kind of the author of the points that have been included on the slides there, says it can actually be more useful to think about what successful inclusion is, because he says it's important to understand that, because when you know what you're doing well, you can kind of scale it up and help ensure that you're doing that more consistently throughout your classroom, but also throughout your setting as well, or perhaps when you are able to go into your cluster schools, etc. So having an awareness of what successful conclusion is and what that looks like within your school, within your setting, is really important. And Shuelka's article, who I'm going to refer to a few points from that now, is on the Pebble Pad as part of Substrand 4. And it's actually quite a nice, straightforward article to read. And it's got several kind of ideas that you might find useful to think about within your own practice. So like I said, I'm just going to draw out a couple of points from that article. Shuelka says that kind of historically, we've understood how successful inclusion has been through quantitative tools that measure access predominantly. So really he thinks that it's kind of just been about numbers and who's included within particular settings. And that makes sense. It's quite a straightforward and simplistic way to kind of count who's in what settings. But however, and more recently, we're kind of shifting our focus, if you like, to think about the quality of education and the educational outcomes that children might have. And actually, we understand that as probably being particularly important in terms of understanding whether somebody is having a successful, experience within education. And Shuelka goes on to suggest within his article that we can kind of evaluate inclusion by reflecting on three kind of aspects. And this is related to, well, I've just seen a comment. Is my screen sharing or not?
Yeah, I can see see your slides.
Brill. Hopefully others can. It does say it's sharing on mine. No? Let me, if I stop sharing, and I'll try sharing it fresh again. Oh, I can see some thumbs up. Great. Let me just get to the right slide now. Apologies for that. Well, thank you. Thanks for highlighting that. Yeah, so Shuelka goes on to kind of suggest then that inclusion can be evaluated by reflecting on three aspects, and these are actually listed on the slide in that top point. That we can look at inputs, we can look at processes, and we can look at output. So we can evaluate inputs, and these are kind of the foundational elements of the school, if you like. So things like the resources, the finances, the policies that we have in the school, the curriculum, the leadership. So we can evaluate those types of things to see how successful inclusion is within our setting. We can look at the processes as well. So here, Shuelka is talking about kind of evaluating the actions, the strategies, and the interactions that we might have within our settings. So that might include things like the general climate or ethos within that school, the school practice itself, what's happening within the classroom, how well we might collaborate, what support we might be providing to individuals. So those are the types of things that he was referring to in terms of processes. And also the outputs then. And this is about evaluate, participation, student achievement, post-school options, things like that. But he also drew out some other components that we can kind of think about in terms of successful inclusion. And those are the other points listed on the slide there. And these are actually aspects that you might want to consider within your own setting to think about whether you're providing an inclusive classroom experience or an inclusive education setting. And those are inclusive policies that promote high outcomes for all students. So this is essentially whether you have policies within your school that refer to inclusion and whether that high quality outcome is kind of really stressed for all students within your setting. And again, that's something that's becoming particularly important, that focus on high quality for all children. That's something that is kind of being drawn out more recently within literature around inclusion. The other point then is related to flexible and accommodative curriculum. So this links with some of the discussions that we've already kind of been having. The need to be adaptive to ensure that, all, the diverse needs of all learners in the classrooms are supported. Strong and supportive school leadership. Again, this has been highlighted as kind of a key indicator for successful inclusion for several decades. And if you think about it, if your senior leadership team promotes and values kind of inclusive practices within the school environment, this can then filter down and shape staff understanding, staff engagement, the priorities of staff within the setting about inclusive practices. And actually, you may be able to reflect on that within your own experience or within your own settings. Is inclusion on the agenda at your school? And I think typically over the years, we on this programme, we've had quite a few, we've had a number of different perceptions on this. Some have positive experience of this, and actually inclusion is at the forefront of what they're doing within their setting, and that can be really helpful. Whereas other settings don't necessarily have that kind of support from their senior leadership team. And that can make a big difference in terms of how successful inclusion is within that setting. Equitable distribution of resources. So this, essentially highlights the need for fair and efficient allocation of resources for all students. And the final one listed, and again, this has been kind of touched at throughout the morning, is teachers who are trained in inclusive pedagogy and view it as their role to teach all learners in a diverse classroom. So do all teachers within the setting embrace their role in terms of teaching and supporting a diverse classroom? And I think this links back in with kind of teacher agency as well. And I know we talked about that earlier, but does everyone see it as their role? Or, is it kind of passed on to TAs or to Elencos to sort of support learners with additional needs? Now, I imagine all of you here have kind of an interest in kind of inclusive education and supporting all learners, but you may know that that's not the case throughout your setting. So these aspects might be quite useful for you to kind of consider and determine whether or not you and your setting is successful. And I think just going back to this morning when we talked about, how inclusion is something perhaps it's more of an ongoing process which can change year on year. It's not necessarily kind of using this as a checklist, yes, we do that and that's that, but it's something that you might be able to use these points to come back to continually to think, how am I doing in that now? What worked really well last year? How can we move on from this? What are the strengths? Can we improve anywhere? And also think about, how do you know something worked? How do you know that you were successful in that? And I think some of the opportunities today where we, discuss these aspects are really useful. And one other point I just want to raise, because again, I'm aware I've been talking a little bit, that comes from Shuelka's article, is that one of his arguments focuses on kind of a common misunderstanding or misconception that inclusive education is about providing more resources to implement inclusive education. But he kind of argues that that's not the case. It's not about increasing educational budget. It's more about, to quote this now, a continuous, systemic and sustained transformation of educational design, culture and values. So I just wanted to include that as kind of a thinking point, really, that it's not necessarily about increasing that educational budget, but thinking about some of those other aspects, continuous, systemic, and that more that transformation of design and culture within the education setting. So building on some of these ideas then, I'm going to get you to reflect on inclusion within your own setting. And address those points on the slide there. And it might be that you'd like to use the points that we just raised, those 5 points from Shuelka, to structure some of your discussions now. But I'd like you to kind of complete the second half of the Padlet there. And think about, how successful are the strategies used within your setting to promote inclusion? How have you been measuring those? How do you know that they're successful? And then again, building on that, how can you continue to kind of promote effective inclusion and practices within your settings? So again, I'm just going to give you 10 minutes for that. So I know it's quite a lot to discuss within those, and then hopefully you can just feed back a couple of the key points that are emerging from some of your discussions. So can we send to breakout rooms now, please? Thank you.
Yeah, just opening now.
Thank you. Fingers crossed everyone can go this time.